Hey Reluctant Preppers, this is showing you just how easy it is to purchase silver without paying any premium over spot price. You just go to sdbullion.com/rp, scroll down and enter the special code to get silver without any premium, and they'll mail it to your mailbox, discreetly packaged. Inside you'll find a beautiful 10-ounce bar of fine silver, and you are able to purchase that and have it and add it to your stack and your collection without paying any premium. And you're supporting Reluctant Preppers along the way. Thanks.
As a responsible person with growing concerns for your privacy and personal liberty, you want to know where we're headed and what you can do about it. We ask the experts what you need to do to take prudent and responsible action to safeguard your family's wealth and well-being, and what basic first steps will help you to be aware and prepared. ReluctantPreppers.com.
Welcome back, Reluctant Preppers. We're privileged to have this returning guest, Beau Doboszenski. He is the owner of Defensive Mindset Training, and he is here with us to talk about a wide variety of topics surrounding personal protection and defense, why elements of conflict are valuable to practice ahead of time, and whether there's a downside to multi-state reciprocity for concealed carry permits. Beau, thanks for joining us here again on Reluctant Preppers.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
We've had you on a couple of times in the past to talk about models for planning ahead and having a multi-step plan in your preparedness for dealing with lethal force encounters. And we've also talked with you about a couple of other topics related to that, such as preparing for litigation defense in addition to physical defense after the event. Tonight we'd like to take a different approach, if we could, with you and get your input on research that you've done recently into the multiplicity of applications for personal protection and defense in our changing world. We talked a little bit before the show about the increasing opportunities and challenges that people are facing in many different venues. We've talked about people in their home environment in the past, home intrusion, that sort of thing, and also safety out when you're out and about. But you were bringing up other topics about what if there's active shooter situations, such as in a public space, like in a school or other type environment. What about cybersecurity? So if you could tell us, in today's world, things are changing so quickly. What are some of the hot topics that you think people need to be thinking of ahead of time and having a plan in place now, and what kind of specific models are you bringing to that environment to help people prepare?
I think one of the most important ones is you mentioned this idea of having a plan for active threats. When we talk about our situational awareness system, one of the modifiers of any environment is what we call an active threat. That active threat, you were in a safe environment, everything was great. Now suddenly it's absolutely dangerous, and what do? Having plans of action established are really important. The reason being that when we go under that lethal force stress, we start to lose the ability of our brains to cognate, to think through things and rationalize and make decisions. That starts to go away. And as that starts to go away, the only thing that we can fall back on is the wiring, that processing that we've developed previously to start taking action. So one of the things that we teach, especially in the Avoid, Deter, Defend video series, is what we call the plan of action. The gist of the plan of action is to, number one, create distance. Number two, you introduce a barricade. Number three is to escape, find help, get a better defensive tool. And then the fourth one is to deter and then defend yourself against that threat. By having these plans starting to be built together beforehand, you can then respond rather than try to come up with what's the new thing to do. With something like an active shooter inside of a school or inside of a place of work, we've seen several of those over the last couple of years. One of the things that's actually very interesting is that people tend not to have these plans for their office space. In Minnesota, where I'm from, there was an attack inside of an office building just in the last couple of years that resulted in the deaths of some of the employees and really spooked out a lot of the office community in the Twin Cities. And so one of the things that we started to sit and think about was, how do we do this? Now, the government also released something too, which we thought was kind of interesting, which was the Run, Hide, Fight campaign, which is, yes, it's sort of right, but it's missing the portion of the fight. What we wanted to establish was, what was the way that you could take a space and defend that space as absolutely to the hilt as you could. And even if you didn't have a firearm, what would you do to defend that space as effectively as possible? And so we came up with a process of doing that we call barricade, go dark, stack, and attack. And what that looks like is the first thing, if possible, is to barricade yourself into a room. And if you can lock the door, that's great. If you can't lock the door, that's okay. What you're going to do is, as soon as you're in the room, is you're going to start to stack things in front of the door. This is engaging in the barricade. So putting furniture, putting chairs, anything that makes it hard for the person to be able to get in. You want them to have as absolutely limited mobility as possible once they've tried to breach the space.
I see. So the stack is not only to be a barrier to opening a door, pushing a door open to get into the space, but even once the door is open, you've still got this huge barricade of a big wall of stuff that's in their way. Okay.
Yep. We wanted this to make it really hard for them to try and get in. And so if they do manage to start getting in, they're now dealing with that barricade of stuff. Meanwhile, you've gone and turned out the lights, so they don't know where you are in the space if possible. So you're pulling window shades, you're doing anything to make it dark where you are and light where they are. That does two things for us. Number one, it allows us to start to develop night vision. You start to develop night vision after anywhere from 5 to 7 minutes, depending upon your age. And it takes anywhere from 20 to 40 minutes to develop your full night vision capability, depending again upon your age and the capability of your eyes. But once you have that, when somebody walks into the dark space, again, they've got that 5 to 7 minute window where they don't have it, but you can see clearly and they can't. This gives us a tactical advantage. This is part of the reason in the home defense, if you could do it, you'd want to set up such that you had the ability to turn lights on in the house, except in your safe rooms. The reason being then is you've blown their night vision, you've retained your own. If the door becomes breached into your safe room, you see clearly, they can't see you. Again, tactical advantage on your side. This is part of the reason a lot of SWAT teams are doing a lot more stuff using flashlights and night vision equipment and things like that. They're trying to find ways to overcome this deficit going into those spaces. So by creating the deficit by going dark, we, again, give ourselves a tactical advantage. The next thing is to stack. And what I mean by a stack is in the military, before you go to enter a room, you get into something called a stack. And how that works is you have one person at the door, the next person's just behind, hand on the shoulder, next person behind that. And that stack could be fairly big. It could be very small, just a room clearing team of 4 people. And that stacking position is very strong because it does two things. One, everybody's all set to go, and they're all ready to, in essence, sort of committed to making some kind of an action. It also, if you stack them up alongside of the wall where the door is, now as the person's coming in, generally speaking, people like active threats, the firearm is their ego here. It's the expression of their ability to generate power. This is my ability to take back everything from the world that it took from me, or this is my way of, I'm famous and here it is. And as they're coming in, that firearm is most likely going to lead that person into the room. This is part of the reason that they spend so much time with SWAT and entry teams trying to condition them to not stick the firearm into the room as they're coming in. They want to pull the firearm back in. And so most likely this person's not been trained that way. The firearm's the first thing leading into the room. But what that gives us now, the distinct opportunity of those of us that are stacked along the wall, is we can now grab a hold. And we can grab a hold of firearm, we can grab a hold of him, we can grab a hold of parts of him. And this is where the idea now from stack to attack comes in. So the room's been breached, you're stacked along the wall, it's dark, which means you have a tactical advantage, and he's wading through that barricade of stuff. And now all of a sudden there's a whole pile of people on him. Even if it's just one person, somebody is now attacking them where they're the most vulnerable, which actually happens to be at the weapon itself. And so it's a really good plan to work and to practice if you've got an office building or things like that, to practice with your office and your employees. If you have children that are old enough to be able to do this, it's a really great thing to practice with the kids. We've practiced it with kids as young as, say, middle schoolers. And what's really interesting is we found doing scenarios with these younger kids is even some of our bigger instructors couldn't handle having 20 or 30 of these kids jump on him at once. And pretty quickly they were able to take him down, and he couldn't swing the firearm around or anything like that. We're using, of course, training tools, and it's very effective. And so if you can give the chance to practice with your kids and practice at your office, you really do have a distinct advantage. It's much like doing a fire drill. The more times that you practice the fire drill, the odds of your surviving a fire in your home or at your school go up by orders of magnitude. This is the reason that schools practice fire drills, and they practice tornado drills or earthquake drills if you live in earthquake zones. And the reason being is the statistics are clear. The more times that you practice this, condition people to respond, the more effective it becomes. And the schools and stuff like that are doing a lot of drills with lockdown drills. This is great. The second half would be, if possible, is to start to teach the staff how to do this stack and attack at key choke points, so that if for some reason bad guy manages to breach the school, they're in positions now where they can start to have a response as quickly as they can. And 2 or 3 teachers grabbing a hold of somebody, grabbing a hold of the firearm, you're probably going to be able to wrestle him to the ground once you start having that much, force on one. And that's our goal, like the ants against the grasshopper in the old tale.
Yeah, we've heard from a couple other guests that's one of the missing elements in this idea of what's the term lockdown has been used so much in recent years, and that what seems to be missing is the idea of people. First of all, it's a weapon-free zone, which means the teachers are all unarmed, or
right.
all the office people are unarmed, so it's completely vulnerable. Secondly, the people are taught to just hide, just crawl under a desk or crawl under a chair or crawl into a closet or whatever, just hide. So it puts them just in this passive, picking off fish in a barrel kind of situation, right, rather than this is turning the tables and having a strategic plan to gain an advantage and then to go on the offense.
Exactly. And that really is the bigger deal is when we start to do the statistics of active shooters. Now, terrorism is a different ball of wax, but active shooters, almost across the board, every time there's an active shooter, once pressure is brought to bear, generally speaking, they end themselves. And so the faster we can start bringing pressure to bear on the active shooter, the faster we get them to do what they actually came to do, which is to die. And, so the more that we can start to turn this into an offensive action instead of a defensive action, it's the old Boyd OODA loop, right? If we're always the one having to respond, then we're always behind the power curve. If we're the one making the bad guy respond, now he's behind the power curve and we have an advantage. What makes this really hard is there's an element. This actually goes back to something that we had talked about, right? There's this element in our society and an element within a lot of us that doesn't necessarily want to explore the dark element of saying, yep, here's this guy. He means me harm. He means my family harm. And so therefore I must condition my mind to say, I'm going to now harm you to prevent that harm happening to my family or to my students or whatever it is. And we're missing out on a lot of these opportunities that we talk about. We talk about how can we find different ways and opportunities in our life to actually explore the conflict and become okay with conflict. Don't shy away from it. It's okay.
Yeah, let's move right on into that, because this application is very critical that we've been talking about, which is this active threat situation. But this applies to so much more in life. And you were speaking earlier with me about elements of conflict that are valuable to practice in life, and how engaging is more valuable than just peacemaking. And it leads us to understanding ourselves, understanding another, what our motivations are, what their motivations are, and can actually be more creative process, much more powerful, much more innovative, much more creating of value and so on than just tranquility, just striving for not ruffling people's feathers, that kind of thing. So can you talk to us about what your research is showing you about the value of opening ourselves to practicing effective conflict?
Yes. So I've been having this sort of year where I've been trying to just listen to a lot of different voices, and there's a lot of stuff that's out there. I think a lot of our society has become really closed off. They're not talking to each other. Nobody's listening. And I think that goes into this idea of people not wanting to engage in conflict. And engaging in conflict is actually super valuable. there's very little that we end up really knowing about somebody that we never have a conflict with. If we end up having, a coworker or whatever, and everything's been great and pleasant, and then all of a sudden something goes really bad at work, we're going to discover really quickly who this person is. Do they keep that demeanor? Do they start to break down? What is it? How do we start to learn who this is? We have different ways in our societies that we've been expressing this realm of conflict for a long time, right? If we think a long time ago, we used to have different tribal warfare and different kinds of things like that, ritualistic warfare. We still have those things. We just call them sports now, right? You very rarely will go and find an athlete that's really had to compete at a very high level that doesn't have respect for the athlete on the other team. And the reason being is he's had to compete. He's had to have that conflict with that other person. I was talking about this actually I have a couple of younger kids, and we were talking about this in the car because one of them was having a conflict with somebody at school. And I said, all the way through school, as I was competing, I was a runner all the way through school. And I was competing against another guy all the way through high school. The two of us were just always just licking at each other's heels all the time. And by the time I graduated high school, I couldn't beat this kid. He could beat me all the time, and it was always really close, and it was terribly frustrating. And it really, really, it was really hard for me to deal with the fact that I was always losing to this particular guy. Well, I come to discover about 3 years later that same guy made the U.S. Olympic track team. Well, no kidding, I'm not going to beat the guy. But I also realized that part of his development to get him to that point was me. If he hadn't had my conflict, the competing with me, there wouldn't have been the push for him to always be a little better, always be a little better, always be a little better. And so that becomes really valuable. We as people engaging in business engagements, things like that, right? Business owners are constantly in this game of how much conflict is okay and how much is not enough. And if you're too agreeable, as the psychologist would say, if you're too agreeable, you get rolled over all the time. And if you're not agreeable enough, well, nobody can work with you. You're a disaster. And so learning to have those conflicts, we teach our kids how to do this as we're growing up with, wrestling and stuff like that between our kids and things where we give them the opportunity to know, okay, what's rough enough and what's too rough. And that learning can happen all the way through adulthood. Some adults didn't have the dad that was doing that with them and things like that. And so one of the ways that we can do it in training for defense is to do things like live scenario work. If you've never been out to do full sim scenario where there are sim firearms that shoot basically something like a paintball, it moves about 300 feet per second. The gun goes bang, it shoots a little fireball. Everything looks as real as it can make it. And when you get tagged, you know it.
Oh, yeah.
That's really valuable because two things are occurring. One, you're starting to recognize the limits of your own skill. And then two, you're engaging in conflict with this other person. And what becomes really valuable is the more times that you do that, the less unnerved you are about engaging in conflict. So I have really advanced students and I have beginner students. And the really advanced guys, on occasion, I'll have them come to a scenario day with the newer students. And part of the training will include something that we call stress ladders. And what a stress ladder is that I would set up, let's say you and I were doing a stress ladder. So you would get in your sim safety equipment and I would get in mine, and then you would take a sim pistol and I would take mine, and we'd each have a couple of rounds in there. And then we would square off at about, say, 20, 25 feet. And I'd say, okay, Dunnigan, you ready? You'd say, yep. I'd say, okay, I'm ready. Okay, good. And then we'd both stand there. And it's Old West time. First guy to go, everybody goes. And what becomes really fascinating is you start to see the moment that people make the decision to go. And you can see it in their eyes. And that seeing it in their eyes, this decision of, oh my gosh, they've just decided that they're going to shoot me, right? That is a super valuable thing to know because now you'll see it everywhere when it actually comes. So people that I know that have been involved in operations overseas or have been in contract work, they all talk about this, the sudden change in the eyes. And they know when it's the moment that here it comes, it's time to fight. What the advanced guys end up finding is they can see this, they perceive that change, And because of their skill development over time, they can still deploy faster. So even though the other guy made the decision to start, the advanced guy is able to respond faster because they recognized what it was and they were able to respond. We at one point had a competitive shooter come through, and he was really, really good. His gun handling skills were just absolutely off the charts. Just amazing competitor. Definitely one of the best in the world at the time. And while we were working with him, he kept saying, well, competition shooting, defense shooting, there's no difference. Well, no, there's a difference. No, there's no difference. There's a difference. And finally, we're like, okay, the only way to show you there's a difference is to bring you into scenarios. And so we took him through 4 live action scenarios where we brought in the role players and all this different stuff. And in 4 scenarios, right, world-class shooter, he died 3 times, went to jail on the 4th. And there just is that difference. And if you're not giving yourself the opportunity to experience those things, even in small ways, you're really doing yourself a disservice in preparing. In one of the scenarios in particular, the gist of the scenario was he was walking down the street and he had to walk past a group of people that were basically up to no good, say a little gang of people. And so the guy comes, he starts to walk down the street. First guy comes out, starts jaw-jacking with him. Well, pretty soon the rest of us start to circle around him. Well, after a bit, he realizes he's being circled. And then we start to do the beatdown. And what we're doing with the beatdown is we had big tie pads, these big striking pads in our hands. And we were sort of hitting him on the side. And he was trying to sort of fend us off, and we're hitting him. And he's still trying to fend us off. He's fending us off. And finally, he pulls a firearm out. But now he won't point it at anybody. So muzzle's pointed at the ground. He's yelling at us. We're still hitting him. Every so often, we'd reach out and grab him by the arm that he's got the firearm. We're trying to say, use it. And he wouldn't use it, We're beating him with it. We finally got him back into a corner. And he had his back to the wall of the building. He had the firearm pointed at one instructor. He had his other hand out towards me, and his foot was up trying to hold off a third guy. So he's on one leg. He's got both his arms out. And we're yelling at him, We're screaming at him. We're going to kill you. We're going off. And all of a sudden, it's like you could see suddenly the shift in the eyes. Just like all of a sudden there was just this look going, oh, I'm supposed to kill you. And so, bang, first shot, he hit the instructor right in the standing right in front. He's like 2 feet away, shoots him right in the chest with one of the sim rounds. And of course, the rest of us, we're waiting for that. As soon as the first shot went off, we scattered because, again, that was the goal, right? You're being attacked, get us to go away. And we all made a deal that the only way we were going away is if one of us went down. And that was the moment suddenly you could see this transformation in his demeanor. Well, then we moved on to stress ladders after that, and you could start to see the change happening faster and faster and faster. That I recognize this is a lethal threat to my safety, and I begin to respond. And that's the real import of doing all of the training, doing all of the scenarios, all that stuff that makes you uncomfortable, is to get to that moment where I can turn that switch on and do what I have to do to protect myself and protect my loved ones, or I can turn the switch off because what I needed to do was enough and the threat has gone away.
Yeah, that in our earlier talk about litigation and the exposure to having your fortune and liberty taken after the event is where people have been, if a threat has been deterred by you and is now turning to flee or whatever, and people just keep on in their heat of the passion of the moment or whatever, if it's with a shopkeeper and the person's running out the door or whatever, and they just keep firing or whatever, and end up using what later cooler heads will call excessive force and that kind of thing. So you're talking about practicing turning on, so not being so slow to be willing to use the necessary level of conflict in order to quickly bring an end to the situation, but knowing also when to turn that off and not let your passions run wild with you.
Yes, that's exactly it. So it's really actually important to be able to turn that moment of aggression on and turn it off. Sometimes with training, we say with guys, right, that they're like a stereo and the power is always on. There's always that little bit of aggression that exists right there. And what we want to help the people learn how to do is to take a hold of the volume button, and rather than let it dial up slowly, be able to grab that volume button, go all the way to 10 and go all the way back to 1 as quickly as you can. So you've hit full bore. I'm ready to do whatever I have to do, go way back to nothing as quickly as you can do it. And being able to have that kind of a control over your aggression becomes super valuable, because then you start to be able to do as much as is required. We try to stay focused with our students about what we call our foundational legal perspective. And it's a series of statements that says what defense is and what defense isn't. And one of those elements is that the force that you used was necessary and that no lesser force would do. And some people have a really hard time recognizing that lethal force is sometimes the only force that's necessary and that no lesser force would do. And to be able to get them to actually cross that over in their brains to make that response is just, it's hugely valuable. The best way that we found to do it is through scenario. So actually to put them in there. And generally speaking, we find that people in their first scenario are not so great. They really have a rough time the first, I'd say ballpark a dozen times they go into live scenario stuff. And then it starts to steadily get better. Like suddenly they cross over this little hump and it gets a little better and it gets a little better and it gets a little better. To give you an example, we ran a scenario one time, and the general gist of it is you were an employer, and what you had to do was fire an employee. And we didn't tell you why you had to fire the employee. You just had to let him go. And one of the role players was the employee that you had to let go. And then another role player was the secretary who was going to help you, hey, your meeting's here. Hey, is there something you want me to do afterwards? What do you want? Well, you go in, set the person down. You say to them, hey, I just wanted to let you know, I apologize for doing it like this, but I'm going to have to let you go, blah, 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 blah. And your role player, no matter how nice you say this and how well you put it, your role player is going to basically start to blow a gasket. And after a little bit, they start to, we use the company that we're connected to is a company called Range Systems, and they make this really awesome foam furniture. And it's strong enough to support you, but you can like shoot through it and throw it around and nothing gets busted. It's really cool. And so pretty soon your role player starts flinging the furniture around the room and he's screaming at you. And what he's waiting for you to do is to deter him to make him leave the room. And so he's going to keep going. He's going to keep yelling at you until you turn up enough aggression to tell him to get out. And so some people do it pretty quick. Some people it takes a long time, but eventually they get to the point where they do what they have to do. Sometimes is, they produce their firearm to help them to get out, but they deter them and the person leaves. Well, here's where there becomes a difference between the person that's willing to turn on the aggression and turn off the aggression. So when we did this once, we had one guy that was an advanced person and one guy that was not an advanced person doing this particular scenario. And the not advanced person, when the instructor left the room, happened to be me at this one. I left the room, I walked around, and I kind of went in a different space. About 30 seconds later, the guy came out of the office with his firearm drawn, his sim firearm drawn, and he was coming to find me, like he was going to sort of hunt me down and make sure that I left. And the sort of standing rule on this particular one is if you could have ended by deterring, then you should. And if you don't end by deterring and decide to come and be more involved, well, now it's just, we're going to see who's got better tactics and capabilities, and we'll find out. So I'd set myself up in a position where he was just in a bad way. So if he was going to come chase after me, it was just not going to go well. And the end result was, of course, he got shot with a bunch of sim rounds and I didn't get hit and he didn't do so well. Well, he was like, well, what should I have done? What should I have done? I said, it's okay. Here, watch the next guy. And so we sent in the advanced guy. Same thing starts to happen, right? You got to fire the employee. Employee starts getting mad. He's flinging stuff around. Advanced guy deters him out. Instructor comes out and he leaves. And as soon as the instructor leaves the door, all of a sudden we hear it from inside the room. He goes, calling 911. And the other student sort of sat there's like, oh, I could do that? Yes, you didn't. Right? Just because you happen to have the tool doesn't mean that you're the one that has to use it right now. Is there another way in which you could engage force. And so we're the one pulled in the secretary into the office and barricaded in the office and called 911. The other one went to follow me out to my car. And there's a difference there, if you will, in, what was more appropriate, that ability to turn it on and turn it back off again. Let's start thinking through and doing those scenarios, having these little ways of engaging in conflict. That's where that value of conflict starts to come in. So we can regain the ability to think through these things.
And before we leave this topic, if we could just touch on how it has application to even non-lethal forms of human endeavor. I mean, this is application to everything, right? When you're having conflict with anybody, it can be a highly creative process as well. You can, as you mentioned about the racing, pressing each other to do your best, to move from just mediocrity to greatness, that kind of thing. We can actually become better people, make the other person a better person, find a result that's better outcome for the team, etc. This can happen in nothing to do with violence or physical threat, but having to do with just coming at things from a really different perspective and knowing how to fiercely and willingly engage for the betterment of ourselves, the betterment of the other person. We all deserve better than this, and being willing to just jump in there. Is there any aspects of that have
totally?
Go ahead.
Yeah, we look at in history actually for a really great example. So we went through a really tough election through 2016, right? And we sit there and we go, man, it was rough and it was aggressive and some parts were just not nice. And what I always sit there and I think of whenever I heard people talking about that was the election between Thomas Jefferson and Adams. And if you go back and look at that election, you would not believe how undignified that election was. It was unbelievable. The basic gist was like I can't remember which one it was that said it, but I believe it was Adams said that or it was Jefferson, that if Adams won, that the United States would basically become a British colony again, and all your daughters were going to be raped, and it was just unbelievable. And Adams called Jefferson a hermaphrodite with neither the fortitude of a man or the gentleness of a woman. I mean, it was brutal, but you couldn't find two minds that, because of their conflict, produced more brilliance in the way of governance and thoughts about rights. Just absolutely astounding. And that conflict really produced it. There was a lot of conflict during, for example, the abolitionists with Lincoln during the Civil War, demanding that liberation happen, that emancipation be done, and that pushed Lincoln right up to the wall to eventually make him have to step in a direction that initially he said he didn't really want to go. Right? There's a quote by him that says, my goal is to save the Union. If none of the slaves were freed, I would do it. If I would free some but not others, I would do it. If I'd free all the slaves, I would do it." And it's like, that's not a person of great, strong conviction. And yet by the end, he was a person of great, strong conviction. And those kinds of conflicts really have produced some of our greatest thought, some of our greatest philosophy has come out of these people having these tremendous conflicts. You think about, it was Steve Jobs was sitting next to Bill Gates at a conference, right? So again, two great minds. And one of them accused the other one of stealing their technology from Xerox. So the other one does the same thing right back. There was just no fear between either of those guys to engage in this hard debate and hard conflict between the two of them, competing for the market share. And both of them have produced astounding product that are being used all over the globe. So no. The ways that we have, or the opportunities that we have to have conflict, don't always look, well, sometimes you can look at it and be, man, this is rough and I don't want to do this. I understand that. I appreciate that. But I think there's also, if we can look at it and think of it in a different way and to say, what is it that I'm learning about me? What is it I'm learning about the other person? What am I learning about who I am that can help me actually develop further on and make my product better. One of the standing pieces at Defensive Mindset is that we operate what we call no ego. And what that means is that, it's not about me, but about the client. And I start every training development or new product from the position that I don't know how to do this right. There must be a better way to do this. And so if somebody has a better way, they'll challenge me on it. And what's really nice is I need to make sure that all my ducks are in a row. So if there's a reason why I shouldn't do something, or why we say we should do something, it's not because do it because I told you to. It's do it because of here's 5 reasons why you should do it. And then if you've got a reason why I shouldn't do that, well, I got 5 reasons. Are your reasons more compelling than my 5? If they are, okay, well, let's test it and see if that's better. And that's just made for us to have to really think about what our product is and what our craft is, and all of those kinds of things. There was a recent post that we have up on the YouTube channel where I just go through high-speed footage to examine how firearms move. And the big point of it was to look at how does your body position and your grip look, because your body position and your grip really make a big difference. And if you don't believe it, well, we can do the high-speed filming and I can show you why it makes such a humongous difference. And all that came out of the place of us when we were designing what we were doing, being challenged about why are we like this? Why would we do this? Why would we hold it that way? Why would we do these ways? And then really have to figure it out. Why?
Yeah, what you're talking about is basically pressing ourselves to achieve greatness or to create greatness, and sometimes that's through conflict with our own inertia or the what we're used to or whatever. Sometimes it's direct conflict with another, and there are different viewpoints. But through that, by being willing to fiercely and fearlessly enter into that, you press on and you find something greater than what either one of you was bringing in the first place.
Yeah, there's no what does the saying go, right? Comfort never brought a great success. I mean, it's true, right? I mean, if you're going to work out, if you're going to see a lot of success, it's going to take a lot. It's going to take effort. You're going to have to work at it. You're not going to suddenly start to lift, lots and lots of weight because, you just decide, oh, I'm going to lift lots of weight. Well, no, you're going to have to build to it.
If we could circle back on the second element of that whole theme that you were just taking us through for the past 10 minutes or so, was about the legality aspects. You mentioned about excessive use of force and stopping before you would use unnecessary force. Another aspect of legality that's been on a lot of people's minds is about the right to bear arms, and specifically concealed carry permits. There's training classes that are different in different states, and they're differing from year to year as the laws get refined or whatever in different states. But one of the biggest things that's going on in that environment is reciprocity, but from state to state. There's maps you can go to where they can show you, if you got your concealed permit in this state, here's all the states that will honor that, and so on. Is that all a good thing? I mean, we've had, frankly, we've talked to sheriffs, we've had direct interaction with other law enforcement folks who've said they are generally in favor of an armed populace, because the saying being an armed populace is a polite populace. Basically, if people know that they aren't, that the population is not going to tolerate misbehavior on the part of a bad actor, things go better in general. But is concealed carry reciprocity from state to state always a good thing, or what's the downside?
If there's a downside, so I kind of lean towards the same idea too, that if possible, right, an armed society is a polite society. The downside is that not all states have the same methodology for determining who can have a carry permit. So in the state of Minnesota, you're required to take a permit to carry class. They ballpark vary, but there's they have to cover the same kinds of topics, so everybody gets the same general information. And then they have to go and submit themselves to a background check, and then they get the permit. Now, Minnesota is also a shall issue state, so unless there's some reason by which the government shouldn't give you a permit, then you're going to get one. But in some states, right, it's what's referred to as a constitutional carry. And again, I'm not terribly opposed to that either, but the end result of that is because you're of a certain age and you have a heartbeat, voila, you're good to go. you see, there's two sides to this. There's a side of rights and there's the side of responsibilities. And on the side of rights, yes, you have the absolute innate right to protect yourself, but you are also under the responsibility, in my opinion, to really know how that tool works, to really know what laws of self-defense look like in your jurisdictions, and to be responsible to really make sure that you can carry and handle that firearm correctly. What makes me nervous about having something like a national reciprocity is whenever we start to go to a national law or a national thing, a national regulation. Take net neutrality as an example. As soon as we had one government in, the Obama administration, net neutrality, voila, it's done. Well, as soon as the Trump administration gets in, no net neutrality, it's gone. And that's my gigantic concern with like a national reciprocity, is that it's great while the Trump presidency is there, but now suddenly whoever gets in there and they say, no, this is bad. And now all of a sudden all the laws go wonky again. When it's between the states, when the states make agreements between each other, yeah, it's a little bit messy, but it tends to be a little bit more stable, right? There's not the swinging back and forth with the change of who happens to be in the office. So on the one side, you have, you want to push people. I want to push more people embracing their rights, but I also want to push harder on people embracing their responsibilities. And the bigger way to do that, in my opinion, is to have less government involved versus more. And so I'm sort of torn in between whether or not national reciprocity is a good thing.
Well, that's a topic that's near and dear to the heart of many. In fact, it's tricky when we live in the middle of the country, and when you travel from state to state here, there are very different laws in these different states about your ability to have, for example, a weapon in your vehicle with you, and how accessible it can be, that kind of thing. So you have to be really informed about that, so you don't run afoul and do these things on the up and up, and stay on the right side of the law, which is what people are trying to do in the first place. So it can be quite challenging. So I think a lot of carry permit holders welcome. They're glad for the reciprocity. And it does cut both ways, because you're dealing with a populace that may have much less training or much less formation in that than maybe you received when you went through your training.
Right. And then the other element, right, so you mentioned the challenges that permit carry holders are having going between the states. So I always think of the case that happened in New Jersey. I want to say it's got to be 4 or 5 years ago now. So a gentleman was living in, I want to say he was living in Virginia, and Virginia has very, very liberal gun laws, right? It's very, very, it's open carry, and, concealed carry is all there. It's, it's a pretty gun friendly state. And his family was from Pennsylvania, and that's also a pretty gun friendly state as well. And, so he was living in Virginia, and for some reason, he had to move home. And so on the way home, he had to pass through New Jersey on the way home. Well, as he was going through New Jersey, he got pulled over for some reason. They searched his vehicle, and in his vehicle, they found 17-round magazines, 17-round Glock magazines. And those are felony to own those magazines in the state of New Jersey. And so here he is, he's just moving between the states. He's not living in New Jersey. He's moving between, he's driving on the way to the move. They arrest him and put him in jail for felony for possession of these magazines. And that's the stuff that, like, a lot of permit carry holders that I know that do any traveling at all, that's what spooks them out, is because they have to go and research what's the law over in the state, and should I carry, can I bring it with me? And nobody's quite sure. And so it just becomes this very, very dicey thing, traveling around carrying that firearm with you. And so, yeah, trying to have the rights to be more, equal amongst the states would be very valuable.
Well, we've been talking, folks, with Beau Doboszenski. He is the owner and lead instructor at Defensive Mindset Training. Beau, if people want to find out more, you've mentioned a lot about scenario and role-playing situations and how irreplaceable that actual experience is. And can you talk to us briefly about what opportunities are available there, how people can find out how they can find those types of training, but also about the other video training that it might be easier for people to get access to quickly if they want to get more awareness and exposure and figure out what their next steps are going to be.
So you can find us on the web at defensivemindsettraining.com. And that's the same name, Defensive Mindset Training. You can find us on YouTube as well as on Facebook. And we've also got a digital training DVD series. One's called the Concealed Carry Masters Course, which is all about carrying a handgun for your personal security. And then another one is Home Defense Rifle. It's all about defending your house using our favorite home defense tool, which is the modern sporting rifle. And then, of course, we've got a full situational awareness DVD series called Avoid, Deter, Defend, where you'll learn how to identify threats at a distance and avoid conflict. It's using the same kinds of materials they teach special operations guys when they go overseas to identify bad guys quickly and start to make sure they don't get into conflict, to stay because they're running in such small units far behind enemy lines. We do regular training up at Defensive Mindset. So we have things from weekly training as well as seminars. We just did a seminar on low light just about a week or so ago. And the seminars are all designed to be as, singular topically focused as we can, just because people tend to only learn little bits at a time. And so we try not to make the topics to be really, really, really broad. But all of our seminars, if possible, include some form of full scenario training. We did one, actually, was a tactical medicine course. And that one included 2 full sim scenarios where they had to not only do medical drills on themselves, medical treatment on themselves, but treatment on somebody else that was with them. And both of those kinds of things are just so valuable for people to be able to have those experiences.
Well, Beau, owner and lead instructor of Defensive Mindset Training, we're always glad for your return visits here to Reluctant Preppers because you're always bringing fresh insights into your ongoing research of new techniques, new approaches, new scenarios, new mindset and applications of this stuff, both for immediate physical protection of our homes, our families, our workplaces, schools, etc., but also how people can apply some of these principles to make themselves and others better that they work with and be able to create a better world. So thanks, as always, for joining us here again at Reluctant Preppers.
Thank you for having me.